Do you often find yourself exhausted after trying to speak your second language, or that you're translating in your head the entire time? It turns out, when you're translating in your head, you're using up a lot of cognitive resources, which can lead to cognitive overload, and it often just slows down the process because you're adding an extra step into that chain. There is a strategy for overcoming this, and while it's not an overnight fix, gradually as you work on this day by day, you start to remove the translation process and it becomes easier to use your second language in a more natural process. My name is Maxwell. I'm a licensed therapist. In the past few years, I've had a keen interest in understanding language learning, anxiety, and how the two tend to intersect. This video is designed to educate you on some of that process as well as this whole channel. With that said, this information is educational and informational only. It is not designed to be a replacement for therapy, nor does this create a therapist-client relationship between us. If you find yourself in a immediate crisis, contact 911, go to your nearest hospital, or reach out to your mental health professional. Always consult with a mental health professional, and please do not ignore any guidance or information given to you by a mental health professional or physician based on information you see in this video. So to start out with, we're going to talk about a theory that was proposed called dual coding theory, and this was created by a guy named Allen Puyville, and I probably butchered that name. If I did, I apologize. He essentially talks about processing information happens down two pathways. He calls it the verbal pathway and the nonverbal pathway. The verbal pathway involves things that are a little bit more objective, and it's more of the patterns of the language that you know, spelling, grammar points, you know, the subject, object, verb pattern, all of that fun stuff. The nonverbal pathway tends to talk about the sensations, the images that you have when you're connecting with whatever you're talking about. Now, obviously, if you're stuck translating in your head, you tend to be stuck in that verbal pathway, and it's hard to get over into the nonverbal pathway because we tend to think in those images. We don't really think in language. We think in something called mentalese, as Steven Pinker describes it. So with that said, the types of information that we learn when it comes to a second language, you can think about in concrete and abstract ideas, or concrete words and abstract words. Concrete words are really the things that you see day to day. There's a glass of water, a bicycle, a laptop, a microphone even. Abstract words tend to be things that are much less tangible, like freedom, fun, you know, things like that. Oftentimes, it's much easier to learn words when they're concrete because you're able to see it, you're able to touch it, you're able to feel it. But abstract ideas are much more difficult to learn because they're simply abstract. We don't have a common reference point for us to touch on. And because of that, we tend to have it get stuck in that verbal pathway. It's very hard or very rare for us to naturally move that into the nonverbal structure. With that said, I think this is why children, it's very easy for them to learn a language because they often live in that nonverbal. They're very imaginative. They're very creative in how they play with things. And in terms of anxiety, right, we often feel safer when we feel certain about things. We feel comfort when we're able to directly say, yes, this is a glass of water, or this word directly means this in my target language, or this grammar point means this in my target language, when oftentimes certain grammar points don't have a direct translation in another language. And if you've been, for example, studying Japanese, you understand this with the wa and the ga particles. So now let's find a different way to conceptualize this that makes it easy for us to go from translating in our head to not translating in our head. And this is an idea that I borrow from deliberate practice. And you might have heard that term, which is the system or the regiment that athletes go into where routines or practice exercises are designed, oftentimes with an expert or a coach, that they can work on their weaknesses. They get immediate feedback. Those exercises can be repeated often, and then they get that feedback from each attempt so that they can apply it to their future attempts in an effort to improve their weaknesses. Anders Ericsson, the guy who created deliberate practice, he wrote in his book, Peak, that when he tried to explain deliberate practice, it was really difficult for people to understand. And to help them understand, he had to explain a concept called a mental representation. And a mental representation, you can imagine, is just the network of information of an idea in your head or a skill in your head. He explains, when you talk about violin players, someone who plays a violin for 10,000 hours is often obviously more skilled than someone who plays a violin for 7,000 hours. Then they're more skilled than someone who plays a violin for 3,000 hours. So you can say the mental representation of the 10,000 hour person is much more deeper, more robust than the person who's played violin for 7,000 hours, and likewise the 7,000 hour person for the 3,000 hour person. So we can say your native language, if it's English or Spanish, whatever your first language was, you could say is a very robust mental representation. It's very deep and it's very intricate. You use it quite naturally. Now, I say your mental representation for your native language can be split into two separate mental representations that often interact with each other. One mental representation is the objective mental representation, similar to the dual coding theory of the verbal pathway, where it's the patterns of the language, the spelling, the grammar, the word order, yada, yada, yada. The second mental representation is your subjective experience. It's essentially, for example, if you think of the term coffee, what comes to mind for you? For me, I think of the warmth that comes when I'm holding a cup of coffee in my hand. I think of mornings because I tend to drink a cup of coffee in the morning, tend to think of energy that I get. Likewise, someone can think of coffee and it may generate ideas of jitteriness or a crash later on in the day. So one person's idea of coffee can be more positive, and another person's idea of coffee can be a little bit more negative. Ergo, it's a subjective mental representation of ideas that are associated with each other. When we are learning a language, I feel a lot of times, and myself included, we get stuck because as we're developing this objective mental representation in our target language, sometimes we just map it on to our own objective representation of our native language. Instead, we have a very robust subjective mental representation that we can use to map that onto. And that's the goal, is that as you're learning the word for coffee, map that onto your subjective ideas, your subjective mental representation images or sensations. And so there's an exercise for this. It's called sensory labeling, and you could think about this in different levels of difficulty. We start with the easy one by thinking about concrete ideas first. If you think of a glass of water, if you're learning the word for water, you can take 5 seconds to look at the glass of water. Imagine what you see. You could try touching the water for a few seconds, feel the coldness of it, and really sit with it for a few seconds. Feel what it feels like to have it be cold in your hands or room temperature in your hands. And then, as you're sitting with that sensation, recite the word for water. If you're studying Japanese, it would be mizu. Mizu. The second step is to move to the next difficult level, which is the abstract ideas or the abstract concepts. And to think about this, remember that abstract ideas are often built on concrete ideas, right? You describe freedom, for example, by being able to choose what you want to study when you go to college, choosing which books you want to read, choosing which food you want to eat. To help with that, start with first learning the concrete ideas of whatever abstract idea you want to learn. So if you want to learn freedom, for example, you may come up with ideas of what freedom means to you, what that allows you to do, and you can be being able to read a book. So maybe first learn how to say book in your target language, learn how to say food in your target language, the types of food you like to eat, and then you learn to sit with that image in your head. And oftentimes you're able to do this by getting a bit creative. If I close my eyes and I think of the word freedom, sometimes I get a color that comes in. Sometimes I get a sensation, maybe it's a cloud that's coming over me, a bright green cloud that often represents freedom. And then maybe that creates a physical sensation inside of me. I'm taking note of all of that as I'm now reciting the word for freedom in my target language. The more you practice this, the more you start viewing terms in your target language in this way, it becomes easier to map those terms onto the subjective mental representation, which is the sensations and images that helps you bypass the translation inside your head. I hope you found this helpful. I hope this explanation was pretty easy for you. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. If you feel there's other topics that you'd like me to explore, let me know below. If you simply like it, simply like this video, let me know in the comments below and subscribe. It helps me to know that this is stuff that's resonating with people, and it obviously helps the algorithm. So I appreciate you sticking around. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.